Much of the story and how to narrate it in a horror experience is spaced, and its atmosphere is carried on because these two categories have a direct relationship with each other, so that the narration of a horror story can beautifully use the environment of that work as a complement and inject a certain psychological fear into it, so that the playing environment with your mind and heart play. It does and uses your imagination. But I don't necessarily mean a 100% environmental narrative here. The Resident Evil franchise, and especially its 3 classic versions, are titles that use the same ambient design and space to amplify their fear, contrary to the belief that monsters are the core of the franchise's fear. Personally, I hear people say, zombies aren't scary and they're old-fashioned, or how do gamers treat the classic versions of the series as scary? But the problem is that Resident Evil never intended to scare the player exclusively by using zombies or its other enemies. But the real power of this collection is in the fear of space and the design of its environment, which alone has been telling stories for hours, and these zombies are also the driving element of this environment. For example, when we walked the streets of Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, it wasn't necessarily just zombies or other enemies like Nemesis that scared us, but also the ruins of a city dying in the darkness of night that penetrated our skin and prepared us to be afraid. Those pre-rendered backgrounds, deserted streets, were the ruinous ambiance that put you in that tense mental space and environment. In part of the game map, we were passing through a place where the children were painted on the ground. This part alone can immerse the player in this world and engage his brain. Where are these kids now? Are they alive? Were they caught by zombies, or maybe even a darker fate? Such contradictory designs, which depict a beautiful and pure theme in the midst of darkness and decay, give the world a good spirit and depth, and can better than anything else evoke the depth of darkness in the player's brain. And this is a persistent form of fear that does not necessarily shake you, but rather increases the weight of the playing area on your mind and brain. Zombies are part of the environment that every single one of them has a story to tell, from their design to how they walk, and even sometimes the environmental narratives that we understand give these gray bodies identities, and such fear is stable, permanent, and memorable, so that even if we go to these works today, we will be aware of the impact of their environment design and story. One of the ways to target the environment design is to create a story independently for the game environment and identify it, because this causes the player to find a psychological relationship with its environment that is separate from other dimensions of the game. One of the most effective approaches, for example, is to let the player get to know and understand the environment, and then put him in the same space, but in a different way, with different twists, which is exactly what psychological effects like Silent Hill or Cry Fear, or even a work like Max Payne do. In the initial version of Max Payne, player several times during Max's illusions returned to his home, but each time the environment became more complicated and strange. And although this effect is not necessarily a horror game, but in these parts it is in a great way using psychological elements as well as its environment to portray Max's mental state, and in this path also pushes the player to some extent. Silent Hill first introduces the player to this strange and mysterious town, allowing him time to search for it and build a specific mental and psychological relationship with it. And then he represents the same environments with a scary, chaotic, and disjointed twist. Psychologically, this creates a mental paradox for the player, which reinforces his sense of anxiety and mental isolation, because now this new form of environment and atmosphere interferes with his previous relationship with the environment and challenges his confidence in his knowledge of this world. This is far more effective than simply leaving the player in an empty and artificial environment that only wants to scare the player through repetitive, monotonous ways. But this is several times more important for games that rely entirely on environment-centric narrative, because now your environment is the story that has to kill the player. A work like PT captures this approach so beautifully that the player is fully familiar with his environment, understands it, and the story being told is also quite in line with the paradox we talked about. Here the creator not only explains the story of the game well for the player, but also makes it the same story of the origin of the game's fear, so that the design of the environment and storytelling are actually two sides of the equation, one of which leads to the eruption of the other. A poor example of this can be found in a work like Scorn, where the environment is more about showing off its artistic side than actually following the rules and telling a clear, engaging, and effective story of fear.